Good morning, everybody. Morning, Louise. Thank you so much for looking after people as they joined by keeping the
I'm just a chatter, I'm sorry.
Right, it's 11 o'clock, and so I just have to apologies. You're all here, but apologies to anybody who hasn't made it, but I can't pay attention to a meeting and to admitting more people. So just to introduce myself, initially, I'm Sean Kelly. I believe we have Tony Lennon with us, who's the Bectu's Research and Freelance Officer. Tony, say hello.
Good morning, everybody. I've already seen quite a few names I know, so nice to see some old friends.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Look, this meeting is, there's a huge number of people here, so I'm going to do a bit of Zoom protocol first off. I guess pretty much everybody has done Zoom meetings and knows most of what you do. But the issue is I have 4 screens of participants and I have 1 screen to look at them on. So I won't be able to see people putting their hands up to talk or anything. So the first one is, can everybody who isn't actually talking leave their microphone muted, because 79 lots of background noise make the meeting inaudible to everybody. The second is, does everybody know how Zoom hands up works? Does everybody want to put their hands up just to check it? Okay, I'm seeing a few shaking heads. If you have a PC and you have a Zoom window, at the bottom you should have a participants button. If you, that's good, Andrew. If you see the participants button, you click that, you should, at the bottom right, get a window which has the option to raise your hand. So as the person running the meeting, I see hands raised, and I see them I see the people listed in the order the hands were raised. So what will happen is, when we have bits of the meeting where we're asking people to make contributions, if people want to talk, you put your hand up, we'll say, Fred, will you say something? Fred, your turn, at which point you can unmute yourself and speak, and obviously mute yourself once it's all over. So that's really very simple. I've got a preliminary. I would like to record the meeting. A number of people can't make it, and they have asked if we can record it and make it available for watching online. So if anybody has a big objection to that, would they speak now? Unmute themselves and speak now. Okay, thanks everybody. That means we will record the meeting. I'll switch it on now, and it'll be online available afterwards. It'll take me a few days, I expect. Okay, so there'll be a number of polls during the meeting, really just to give us information on your situation and on the freelance situation in general. Those polls will stay up for probably about 3 minutes on average. The responses are anonymous. That means we will have a record of who voted how many, but we won't know who the individuals were that voted each way. So you can vote in the polls completely honestly, just to tell us what your personal circumstances and what you're thinking are. I'll deal with a bit of meeting overhead. The duration of the meeting, I'm hoping to finish at 12:30. If we have to run on, because people wanted to run on, that isn't a problem. My diary is free for a couple more hours. So the aim would be, this is not going to be an interminable session where people just, start dropping off because they can't keep going any longer. If we are going on for a long time and we need a 5-minute comfort break, that's okay. So we'll deal with that if and when the time comes. Post-meeting, I propose to send an email to everybody. It'll have things like the poll results, it'll have links to everything we discuss, and it'll probably have some brief notes of the meeting. So that you'll all get that. If I've got your email address, it's possible that some people here have joined without having joining links. Excuse me, I've got more people to admit. If people join without having emailed me for a link, I won't have their email address. Please send it to me at, I'll put my address in the chat right now. So anybody can email me with post-meeting comments or requests for emails or whatever. Let me just send this. It's OB Network at bectu.org.uk. And that's on the chat, so everybody can see that. Excuse me a moment, scroll down. So right, we're on the meeting. We've got a very kind of informal agenda, but obviously we're going to start off again with some formalities. Probably a good number of you, I know, aren't members of Bectu. You probably are aware, but I'll make sure you are aware now. Bectu is the only union for entertainment broadcasting workers such as yourselves. We represent people in staff and freelance grades all across the industry, and that's our job. and we enjoy working with those people. Most Bectu reps are ex-activists, and I'm Sean Kelly. I was a vision engineer. I joined the BBC in 1981. I left it in 2008 when it sold its outside broadcast business to CIS, and I left CIS when it folded and was a freelance engineer for a few years before coming to work for Bectu. Tony Lennon, who's here with us, who's already introduced himself, is also a vision engineer, though he's been on the tools or off the tools for slightly longer than I have. But he and I met together on the BBC Outside Broadcasts Branch Committee when we were based in Kendal Avenue in Acton. I just say, on a personal note, it's really good to see so many people whose names and faces I recognise from probably 3 years ago when I last worked on an OB. So great to have you all here. The aims of this meeting, the first aim really is just to start, it's the start of a programme of regular Bectu Outside Broadcast Network events. Bectu doesn't have, as you know, a branch for people in outside broadcasts. When I came to work for outside broadcasts, people on reception and membership started directing all the OB queries in my direction because they said, oh, you've just come from OBs, you'll know about that. What it became obvious to me was that a lot of people in OBs don't really participate very much in their branch, be it camera branch or sound branch or whatever other branch, largely because the branches tend to meet at weekends. And if you're in OBs, you're probably working most weekends. But a lot of freelance branches, actually, people have the weekends off. So I started this outside broadcast network. I was asked by Bectu to start an outside broadcast network. It's basically a mailing list for outside broadcast people. But if members of it want to take it further, we can take it further. We can put in place a committee and a regular program of meetings and actually do things to improve lives for outside broadcast workers and improve the profile of the union for those people, so that actually the more people are in, the more power we have, the stronger we are in a given OB. So I would like this to be the first of a regular series. It's become possible. This is only the second outside broadcast network meeting. It's only the second because the first received 30 apologies and 6 people turned up because of, I've suddenly got a boxing match or I've got a football's come up. Great intent, but really hard to have meetings. We've all been forced by the current pandemic to start using technologies such as Zoom, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to carry on holding regular outside broadcast network meetings using this technology, bringing together a group of activists who will work to make things better for them in the industry. That's the first aim of the meeting. The second aim is to find out for us how the pandemic is affecting OB workers and what we together as a group and as a union can do to make that better. And the third aim is to talk about how we as a group and again as a union can work to make people feel more confident that they're going back to work safely when they go back to work. So it's pretty open-ended. There'll be an opportunity for any other business at the end, but if anybody has anything they think I've missed off the agenda, which I should have mentioned at this point, please drop me a text in the chat, rather. Drop me a chat. So look, the first bit, if everybody is okay with where we are, and I'm not seeing anybody's fallen asleep yet, and I'm not seeing any glazed eyes, is with a few minutes really, I'd like to talk about the government support schemes, just so that we can get a feel for where people are in that, and anybody who doesn't understand can ask questions. So that really is Tony Lennon's brief. I'll just ask Tony Lennon to take over this bit of the meeting, just to say hello and ask you really. I'm going to run a couple of polls while Tony's talking. Are you okay with that, Tony?
Yeah, absolutely fine.
Introduce
Sean.
the 2 schemes and then see where we go.
Sean asked me to keep this sort of fairly short. I do actually have a very long series of slides to show people about the various support schemes that have been started up. But I'm getting the impression that most people in the business have begun to work out where they stand. But I will run through exactly what's on offer. If you're an employee or were on a PAYE contract before a couple of key dates, there is scope for employers to actually furlough you, which basically means sending you home and claiming 80% of your salary from the government and either giving you the 80% or maybe in some cases topping it up with their own money to 100%. The conditions about furlough are essentially you need to have been the subject of a PAYE report called a real-time information report in the last tax year. And you also need to have been on some form of contract either before the 28th of February or the 19th of March. Now, in our sector, quite a lot of people work as intermittent PAYE workers. That is, that you go and do a really short engagement. You don't really feel like you're an employee, but you go and do a short engagement and you discover you've been put through the PAYE system, usually because your engager doesn't believe that the relationship is one of self-employment and you haven't billed them through a limited company. We've been having desperate problems with the intermittent PAYE workers, particularly in the film industry, although the good news in that sector is that the companies, the big Americans in particular, have gone out of their way to help people. They've often, even if they can't furlough them, they've made discretionary payments to them to keep them going. From their point of view, it's quite sensible because they want those people to be there when they resume the projects that have all been stopped at Pinewood and Shepperton and Leavesden. And they want the crew to come back. They don't want to find them all gone off to be, you know, supermarket workers or receptionists in hospitals or whatever, you know, people might find as alternative employment. So I'll be doing questions. If there's any questions about the furlough scheme, fire them at me. But we're now at a point where things are pretty settled. If people are being furloughed, they know it by now. Some employers in the industry have been prepared to retrospectively put people back on the books, which is permissible in certain circumstances. But I have a feeling that the other scheme, which is most relevant to people, except for company directors, I'll come back to that, will be the self-employed income support scheme. That essentially is up and running. It's now been running for just over 2 weeks. If you're eligible for it and you're a self-employed sole trader, right, you will have heard from HMRC by now, and if not, get in touch with them. Essentially, to qualify for the self-employed income support scheme, you need to have filed your tax return for the year 2018-2019, which was due in by the end of January this year. There was a further window opened up by the Treasury, interestingly, which closed, I think, on the 23rd of April. But up till that point, you had an opportunity to make a late filing, which would be unusual because by then you've normally been fined to death by HMRC for not getting your return in on time. And provided you qualify for that, and your income was lower than £50,000, big catch, and your self-employed income represented more than 50% of your total taxable income. And if you do your self-assessment on the SA 100, you know you have to put in things like, you know, income, interest income, foreign income, rental income, etc., etc., etc. All of this is taxable. But provided you meet the 50% rule and the £50,000 rule, in other words, your self-employed income was less than 50k, then you are qualified for a payment equivalent to 3 months of 80% of your average over the last 3 years. And if you haven't got 3 years, there's various ways of doing it pro rata. A lot of self-employed people have been contacted by HMRC. They meet the tests. Our big problem with this scheme has been the 50k limit. And for some people, the 50% limit, particularly if, you know, they've got a year where they had a mixture of employed income and self-employed income, that they often don't meet the 50% test. But the 50 grand limit has been a real problem, because although it seems to sound like a lot of money to people in Whitehall and the Treasury, actually, if you're in our business doing the sort of jobs that you do and working the sort of hours that you do, £50,000 is not an untypical level to expect over the course of a year as a reasonable income. So lots of self-employed people have been excluded from the scheme. We have been talking every week to the Treasury about this, and our last conversation with them was on Thursday of last week, I think, and we were basically told to stop banging on about the 50k limit. Sorry, it's not going to change. So we've directed an awful lot of members to the only alternative at the moment, which is apply for universal credit. Don't be ashamed of it. You may not get it, but all you can do is get turned down. There's no penalty for applying if you don't deserve it. So that really is, you know, the one place that we can send people. And we've also directed a few members to a couple of charities to specialise in our sector. The big one of which, Film and TV Charity, I think has now closed its books because it's given all its money away. But that may be worth following up. And if you go to our website, you'll find some links. back to company directors, and this is for people who are working through personal service companies, limited companies, which is an increasingly common model, particularly in the OB sector for some strange reason. If you work for your own company, you are an officer of the company, and you are automatically, for tax purposes, treated as an employee. Okay. As a result of this, a number of people in our sector, and some of them didn't realise this because their accountants had never told them, but a number of people found that they were in receipt of a PAYE salary. Normally, it would not be very much because it would be enough money either every month or every year to give you some tax-free income within your personal allowance, but not to trigger Class 4 national insurance contributions, which from the primary threshold is last year it was £8,632. So that's a figure that might be familiar to some of you. We've got a number of problems with the employed status of these people. Firstly, their income from their private company is obviously not just the salary. They depend on dividend income, which comes through shares. This is not a tax fiddle because you pay, before you can do a dividend, you need to make a profit. And when you make a profit, you get taxed from £0 on that profit at a corporation tax rate of 19%. And there's no personal allowance on corporation tax. So, you are paying almost the same as an employee would be paying if they were being paid through PAYE. And the problem we've got there is that the only money that qualifies for the furlough scheme would be that fairly modest, usually around £8,500 per year, which isn't very much, but it's better than nothing. But the other problem we've got is that where payments are made on an annual basis by accountants have got this thing about year end, which for them is 31st of March, all right? And a lot of members have found that their salary payment through PAYE was being made on the 31st of March. This is after the cut-off date of the 19th of March, which the HMRC and the Treasury have imposed on the furlough scheme. And as a result, they don't qualify for furlough payments. Again, we've been talking to the Treasury. We've made many suggestions to them. The Treasury's cardinal problem, because they're terrified about fraud and moral hazard and all this kind of thing, their cardinal problem is that when you make your self-assessment return and you reveal that you have income from share dividends on the SA 100, there's only one box and you just put it in as an aggregate. And the Treasury from the beginning has been saying, well, we don't know where this money comes from. We just know it's dividends and it's part of their taxable income. Although it is taxed at a lower rate than income tax, it's only 7.5% for a basic rate taxpayer. And we've come up with ways to try and persuade the Treasury that they actually can get a fairly good snapshot of our members in these companies, partly because they're all legally meant to be issued with dividend vouchers when the dividend gets paid. So you can go and ask the accountant for a copy of the dividend voucher. And secondly, there will be past, for people who file on the 31st of March, there will be past behaviour in many cases where HMRC can easily go and look back over, say, the last 3 years and spot the fact that every year on March the 31st, they received a PAYE salary that was equivalent to the primary threshold for national insurance. Sadly, although the last phone call we had with them last week wasn't completely unproductive, and we weren't told to stop banging on about this, we're getting the impression that things are so far advanced that if they had been planning to do something about the dividend problem for people who are company directors but currently struggling to put food on the table, if they were going to do anything, they'd probably have done it by now. But we are still working on it, and we still are talking to the Treasury about a whole range of issues around those two schemes. So I've described to you the job retention scheme, relevant to people who were on PAYE, but there are all sorts of hoops and dates that you've got to meet. I've told you, as you probably knew about it already, the self-employed income support scheme. I'm going to close by mentioning some of the loan schemes that are available for businesses of the size that we are, which is small. There are two things available. One I wouldn't recommend is the business interruption loan scheme. Then they're schemes that were facilitated by the government, but they're run by individual private lenders. Okay, so there were problems about the business interruption scheme. You had to apply for quite a big loan. After the first year, you went up to a really serious commercial rate of interest. There were credit checks. There was a business viability check, etc., etc., etc. Since then, and this goes back almost to early April when they first announced that scheme, they've made amends by introducing a thing called the bounce back loan scheme. I would recommend this to people. At least go and look at it. It is a loan, but for the first year, you make no capital repayments and there are no interest charges. So it's free of everything for the first 12 months. You start to repay capital and pay interest from month 13 after you get the loan. The credit checks are extremely light. All you need to do to apply for one of these loans is to confirm that you were in business at the end of December and you had a viable business at the end of December. You've been affected by coronavirus, which, you know, anyone who's lost out on work, obviously that's a result of events being cancelled due to the virus. In a survey we did a couple of weeks ago, to my pleasant surprise, nearly half the members who had applied for one of those loans already had actually received something. So, you know, I know it's not a grant, it has to be repaid, unlike the grant that you get through the self-employed support scheme, and unlike the wages you would get through the furlough scheme if you qualified for furlough, which are normal salary, so they get taxed and subject to national insurance. But the bounce back loan scheme is something worth looking at, I think I've covered three of the main things that members are being directed to go and look at by us. The last thing I've mentioned already is universal credit. Do think about applying for it if you are in financial distress, as I know a lot of people are. It's a tortuous process, but two things have opened the gateway for freelancers. One is that historically, freelancers who are self-employed have been excluded in effect from universal credit because of a thing called the minimum income floor. The minimum income floor is an assumption by DWP that if you're self-employed, you must be getting a background income, and that background income is equal to 35 hours a week at the national living wage, which I think is £8.71 now. That doesn't sound like a lot. However, that background income they assume you're getting is usually enough to bounce you out of most components of universal credit. There's also a means test. The household savings and income will be examined if you apply for universal credit. If you're with a partner, all right, children don't count, lodgers don't count, but partners and spouses do. If you're with a partner who's got reasonable income, you may find that means tests you out of universal credit. If there's no other income, but you have savings of more than £6,000 and less than £16,000, there's a clawback that starts at £6,000 and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. By the time you get to 16 grand, if that's the level of savings that you have, you get nothing out of universal credit. However, if you're self-employed, you need to know about a thing called the capital disregard. And to be fair, members who've applied for universal credit have normally had this explained to them by their advisors at the job centre. The capital disregard is a provision for savings to be ignored if you are self-employed and you can demonstrate those savings are actually for my business, they're not for me, I'm not planning to touch them. So for example, if you were expecting to get the payment on account as a self-assessed taxpayer in July, you know, HMRC coming after 6 months worth of tax from you, you can legitimately say to the DWP, look, some of this money here is because I've got a tax bill and I've worked out what it is. And even though there's a waiver on that payment is not going to be collected in July. It will fall due in January. But you're able to say, look, I'm getting a tax bill in January for money I've earned this year. Part of what I've got in my savings is for business purposes because I've got to give it to HMRC. Therefore, I shouldn't be subject to quite the high level of tariff because I've got some savings in the bank. That's probably about all that I need to say. And in fact, I went on so long, I could have done my slides anyway. I'm sorry about that, but you just had to put up with me talking to you. Right, Sean, back to you.
Okay, so Tony, really it's open for any questions. You know, if there's any questions on the job support scheme, put on either of them or how they apply or what we're doing about them or anything that Tony said, you put your hands up and we'll have 5 minutes on that if necessary. if anybody's got anything they want to ask. I'm not seeing any hands up. There's a few new joiners, just reminding everybody that the way we're asking people to participate is by putting electronic hands up. You get the electronic hands up by selecting the participants button at the bottom of your window, and then you'll see a raise hand option on the bottom right. And when you're asked to speak, please unmute yourself. So Pete Murray has a question on this, Tony.
Hi, yeah, question for Tony. I know you guys have been lobbying the Treasury for all of the support schemes and whatnot. Firstly, how is the lobbying going for the PSC company directors? There's been musings and whatnot online saying it's a flat no, then there's a maybe, etc., etc. And then from my own personal point of view, the self-employed employment support scheme, is that going to be extended in line with the furlough scheme?
Right, thank you. Right, thanks, Pete. Right, on the first one, lobbying. Yeah, we have been talking directly to Paul Scully, the relevant business minister, about this. And I think I can share with you the fact he's had lots of letters from constituents who are in the tricky position of company directors in personal service companies. And there's a degree of sympathy from him. There isn't, as far as we can tell, much sympathy from the civil servants around him. Because bluntly, yeah, it's amazing what you learn, but it's quite clear that the whole of Whitehall is still rooted in the idea that people work for employers in permanent jobs and work Monday to Friday 9 to 5, and they look like civil servants. I mean, I'm not joking. The wall we're up against is really quite fierce. But the lobbying is continuing. You know, we're getting sympathy from the political side, but not getting much sympathy from the civil service side. To be quite fair, we did have a major breakthrough because we were one of the parties that lobbied the government about the arbitrary nature of the February 28th cut-off, which was the original cut-off date. And we'll be doing it partly because lots of people started work during March on longer running projects. You know, it's sort of the beginning of the shooting season, and that's when prep starts. And we managed to get the date moved to the day before the job retention scheme was announced. And it was announced on the 20th. So they agreed to move the date to the 19th on the basis that no one until the 20th knew the scheme was going to be there. So if they were in an employment relationship, it was a genuine employment relationship, and they weren't just trying to pile in after the event to take advantage of the government scheme. They flatly refused to move the date any further because, again, back to this moral hazard thing, they're terrified of fraud. They're terrified that people will invent employment relationships after the 20th of March so they can claim government money when the relationship would never have existed in the first place. And that's the problem that we're having with the directors' filing dates, all right, which is the question you asked about, which we're still lobbying on. But they've dug in on this one so far in the sense that they're saying, we don't know if on March the 31st, when you got a PAYE payment, you were just taking advantage of the scheme that was announced a week and a half before, or whether you were always going to do it, which is why we've pointed them to the dividend vouchers, and we've pointed them to previous behaviour being a very good indicator of what should happen. Right, as for the extension of the self-employed support scheme, yeah, we're lobbying on that as well. Nothing has been said yet. We haven't had a yes or a no on a possible extension. At the moment, it's scheduled to end at the end of June. It will seem perverse, frankly, that the self-employed community, who are often held up as being a fine example of flexibility and entrepreneurship by the government, if those people are in an unfair position compared to employees, because it seems whatever happens and however much employers have to stump up, the job retention scheme for employees is going to continue till the end of October. And we think, in fairness, that that should be exactly the position of the self-employed support scheme, because you know, your income is your wages, and actually the self-employed have already been disadvantaged enough by the 50 grand limit. There's no £50,000 limit for employees on the furlough scheme. So you could be a solicitor, you know, on £250,000 a year. You could furlough yourself, and you could claim 80% of your wages up to a maximum of £2,500 per month. So I hope, Pete, that explains that we are still trying to do stuff, and we are still in communication with Treasury. I was in on the call with them last week, and I mean, I got the impression the civil servants we were talking to on that occasion were very senior people. Well, one of the people we were talking to was the civil servant actually in charge of the whole job retention scheme. I got the impression they understood where we were coming from. Okay, but they're obsessed with fraud, frankly. So you know, let's. I don't want to build your hopes up, but let's watch and see what happens. Okay.
Okay, Tony, I've got a couple of questions coming in on text. James French, I've got your hand up as well, so I'm dealing with them in order. I've got a question from a member saying, I haven't applied for universal credit as I have a property I rent out. Do you know if it's worth bothering? I assumed it would get counted, and I counted.
Right. Yes, that income will be counted as your household income, depending on the ownership structure and things like that. I would still apply for it. And is this James who asked the question?
No.
All right. Okay. Well, hello, James. Anyway, nice to hear from you. Look, I would still apply for it. There's no penalty for applying, even if you don't deserve it or get it. And if you don't apply, you won't get anything. A lot of people have been pleasantly surprised that you at least get something out of it, even if it's the basic award, which is just over £94 a week. But the answer to your question is that rental income will count towards your household income.
Thanks, Tony. And another one, can I ask if you know how long applications to the bounce back loan will be available?
I'd have to look that up. It is time limited, but there's still time to do it. What's really impressive about the bounce back loan scheme is how quickly people are getting the money. I mean, they're like getting approvals on the same day, and they're getting the money sometimes 2 or 3 days later. And if you want a bounce back loan, go and do it, okay? Because things can change.
Okay, thanks, Tony. And James French, please unmute yourself and say your question.
Hello, Tony. Yeah, thanks very much. I'm benefiting from the sole trader support scheme, which I think covers April, May and June.
Yes.
I'm looking at the news today. It looks like there may be some football work coming up in June. If I accept that, is that somehow going to impact on the money that I've already had? Will I have to pay some of it back?
No. Interesting. There is no mutual exclusivity amongst any of these things, in the sense that if you're furloughed, you can, for example, go and work for somebody else, right? Provided your furloughing employer does not invoke an exclusivity clause in your contract, because the contract of employment is still there. You can apply for universal credit, and certainly if you're self-employed, you can go off and do self-employed work despite applying for the loan. Now, you will have answered the question, right, in the application process, that you were affected by coronavirus, which you were. But there's absolutely no indication that HMRC has any intention of following up whether or not you really needed the money and trying to claw it back. So you can take the work. Nice to see you.
Thanks.
And next is Charles Battison.
Thanks very much. Hello, Tony. It was just in regards to what you were saying about the bounce back loans. I sort of have a bit of a concern, if I should say it like that, about grabbing a loan and then potentially getting into even more debt. Is it really worth getting one as such? Because, as I said, just my concern about adding more debt, or if anything should happen.
Well, I'm not a financial advisor, but look, what you're being offered, if you qualify, and we've been pleasantly surprised by the number of people who just been through the process and get the money, but what you're being offered is a year's worth of free money. Okay, there's no capital repayments, no interest repayments, and in month 13 you will start paying at a very low rate of interest, and you know, you've got to weigh this up for yourself. But if you need to put food on the table and you haven't got resort to anything else, this is a lot cheaper than running up bills on your credit cards. It's a lot cheaper than applying for a commercial loan through your own bank, and I would tend to look at it as being, well, 12 months of free money. Who wouldn't?
Okay, thanks, Tony. I've got a couple of comments that have come in by message. One is just to note that the bounce back loan applications are available until early November. And the second is a question. Do you think there'll be any more help for freelancers who have been pay-as-you-earn sole traders? I don't have any clarification on what that means exactly, but I think it's about when it runs out.
Well, look, I mean, the real progress we've made on this has actually been with the employers and not with the Treasury. The Treasury is sticking firmly to two cardinal dates, which are the 28th of February or the 19th of March, take your pick. But they most unhelpfully, and this was written by HMRC, and I think I know who's writing it, but HMRC took it upon themselves to make a reference to fixed term contracts, which is not supported by the bit of legislation under which the job retention scheme operates. But the advice they gave was that people could not be re-employed if their contracts had expired before either of those dates. So, yeah, we've got lots of people on daily contracts, very short contracts around the industry, who had a bit of work in February or March, but are now being told by most employers, I'm sorry, we can't put you on furlough. To be fair to the employers, and we'll probably name some of them once this is all over because they deserve credit, but I don't want to draw attention to them just now. You know, a lot of employers have been very imaginative about how to treat people who they have a relationship with and were working on an intermittent PAYE basis. And, you know, they haven't all done it, but a lot have actually been very helpful in terms of Sean will probably know better than me how we're faring in the OB sector, but generally they don't have much money, unlike the big film companies, and they don't. Most of them don't have a history of being terribly helpful on things like this. Am I being unfair there, Sean?
No, I don't think you are. People will correct me in the meeting if I'm wrong on that. No, so I've got I've got an observation here from a member who said he applied for a bounce back loan, and the money took 24 hours to arrive in his account. So that's pretty good. Another answer, I'm applying for question. I'm applying for universal credit. Will the bounce back loan stop the universal credit payments?
If it ends up as money in your bank, yes, it probably will count as savings, unless you're self-employed and you can argue that one way or another you qualify for the capital disregard, which I think will be quite a bit difficult if you've actually gone and borrowed money to put in the bank.
Okay, and Robert Krieger, your question's next, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. A couple of things. One's a comment and one's a question. Just in case people aren't aware, if you're a PSC limited company and you get a bounce back loan, it's described as solely for business purposes. So I don't think you'll be able to sort of get the loan and then immediately start drawing it out of your business account as drawings. That's to be clarified by my accountant, but that's what it seems to be suggesting. So I imagine you can use it to pay corporation tax and your monthly salary and your accountant's bills, but very little else, I imagine. The other thing, this question is from a colleague actually, and it was to say that at the start of all this scenario, there was various talk of slush fund from the BBC for freelancers in distress, possibly from Bectu the same. Some of the larger broadcasters also mentioned this. Have you heard anything about any of this money coming through from anywhere other than the government?
Yeah, not my specialist subject, but I am aware that the film and television charity did receive grants from a number of employers. I think the BBC might have been one of them. We've got a problem with the BBC in terms of the job retention scheme. I'm not dealing with this, it's other colleagues are involved in the discussions, but the BBC as part of the public sector cannot furlough its public service employees, okay? So, for example, BBC Studio Works is okay, BBC Studios Limited is okay because it's a commercial subsidiary, but people working for BBC News or other bits which are genuinely public service shouldn't be put onto furlough, and that's a instruction from the government. However, unlike other bits of the public sector where there is guidance about the contingent workforce from the Cabinet Office, which says very clearly that where you have contingent workers for whom there is no work, for a variety of very sensible reasons, you need to emulate the furlough scheme and you should send them home and give them 80% of their wages. The BBC is saying to us that they can't really afford to do that, especially because they have postponed the resumption of over 75s paying the licence fee, presumably to help people out during this difficult time. They'd factored all that money into their accounts, it's not there, and they are flatly refusing to furlough people in the the public sector bits of the BBC, but there are some furloughs going on. They're not as generous as some other employers, and they really aren't, but there are some furloughs going on in bits of BBC studios, for example.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Right, I've got 4 more hands up, and I think I'm going to try and wind up this bit of the meeting within the next 5 minutes, because we obviously want to talk about getting back to work, whether that's possible and how. So I've got 4 hands up. I'll say a last call really for hands up. And once we get past those 4, and only they come up in the next minute, we'll move on. I have an observation, Tony. Somebody sent me a message saying that if you get a bounce back loan, it goes on your business account. And therefore, should it affect UC?
If it goes into your business account, yes. I mean, I didn't properly answer Robert's question, so let me just sort of return to that one quickly. If it goes into your business account, right, it would not normally be counted as part of your household savings. And if you're using it to pay a salary, and don't forget that the biggest costs for all these PSCs is actually the cost of paying the owner-operator via salary and dividends. And if you choose to award yourself a more comfortable salary, which is paid out of the bounce back loan, I don't think there's any restriction on you doing that, to be perfectly honest. For universal credit purposes, if it's in a business bank account, fine. I think you'd get into some difficulty if it goes into your personal account if you're a self-employed sole trader, but then you need to understand that there is this thing called the capital disregard, and you may be able to persuade the job centre that that money is not for you, it's for business purposes and should not count towards the £6,000 tariff that they apply. But if you do apply for universal credit, you will find, depending who you get, actually the frontline advisors in job centres they're usually quite well versed in all this stuff, and they're actually usually very helpful, even though you can take a long time to get through to them on the phone.
Thanks, Tony.
I'd also, on universal credit, the other thing I ought to remind you is that apart from the minimum income floor being a barrier, usually there is a conditionality attached to universal credit, and the condition is you need to sign a contract that says I will go off and I will apply for X jobs per week, right? And if I get one, I'll go and take it, which of course is a massive barrier for freelancers. That has been suspended, as has the requirement to physically attend a job centre. It's all done over the phone at the moment. So they've made it a lot easier for freelancers to apply for universal credit, provided you remember the capital disregard. I don't think it will interact with a business bounce back loan, provided you're able to explain what the loan's for. And if you're taking the loan to pay yourself a salary, you're probably in a position where you're going to be getting enough not to require universal credit. So I hope that's a bit clearer.
Thanks, Tony. Right, look, I'm going to take 4 more questions. We've got John, Tony, Gordon and Hazel in that order, and then we'll move on. Any outstanding questions, drop us an email. We'll make sure they're answered in the post-meeting roundup. Okay, John Nettleship, your turn to unmute yourself.
Yeah, something I've raised before, but I so implore you not to forget those that have been cut out due to having just less than 50% of their income from freelance work. Because mine's dropped below, my work's tailing off, probably not unconnected with the fact I'm 63 years old now. And so those of us caught out like that have got nothing. It's not like 80% of a small amount, it's 80% of diddly squat. And I've noticed in your little poll that you put up, it doesn't mention us, those that are getting nothing because our income just drops below 50% of our total income, even though it's clearly my main income. I've got a bit of pension from the Beeb that started already, a bit of a rental property that brings in a bit of money, and I've had not a lot of money coming in from my TV work, so I've got not a lot coming in, and I get no help at all. So I'd just like this to be remembered in any lobbying or anything.
Oh yeah, John. No, this 50% rule is something that we have been raising with the Treasury. Our argument is, look, it doesn't matter what proportion of income it is. This is income that people are now not getting. Okay, and the general principle of your job retention scheme is that people should be recompensed up to £2,500 a month because their income has dropped away. We don't see why this doesn't apply to the self-employed, who can usually demonstrate, whether it's 50% or less, that they have an historic record of their self-employed earnings constituting a portion of their overall income. I mean, they stuck by the rule. 50% of taxable income has not changed in the weeks and weeks we've been discussing this with them. But at the end, on these calls, I generally say to people, can you please write to your MPs, and I'll do it now. You've got to explain two things to them. One, they're hearing from government that all these schemes add up to a fantastic support matrix for everybody at work. Well, it's not true, right? John, you've just described a case of somebody who has fallen through the cracks, as we're describing it. So you've got to explain personal circumstances and why you've fallen through the cracks. Secondly, we've got to deal with this Whitehall myth that people who are either self-employed or directors of their own companies are automatically doing quite well. So we can impose restrictions and thresholds on them that we don't do to employees. I think you've got to explain to them, for example, if you're living in the southeast of England, where I'm based, all right, 50 grand a year sounds a lot to many people, but if you add it all up, if you're working in film and television, actually you don't have much left over at the end of the day, and you don't have yachts in the Mediterranean or mansions on the banks of Lake Geneva and stuff like this. We're not millionaires. So those are the 2 points that you really ought to convey to your MPs. That we've fallen through the cracks. The schemes you've launched are not universal, and secondly, we're not millionaires. We're not, and I'm quite sure, John, that you'd be able to demonstrate that you are definitely not a millionaire, despite your pension from the Beeb and a little bit of rental income.
Far from it. Well, the opposite.
Thanks, Tony. And the penultimate question is from Tony Wass. You'd unmute yourself, Tony.
Yeah, it's just an observation actually about the the C-bills loan, which I did take out because it was the only one available before the bounce back happened. I've since discovered that you can convert that to a bounce back loan, and I'm in process in NatWest trying to do that, but it's virtually impossible to get any sense out of NatWest. It took me 2 months to get the C-bills loan, so that was unfortunate. But I did actually get the loan. I got the money, but I think old Charles was worried about this. I mean, what I've done, I just put it in an account. I'm not touching it because, as you say, it's an emergency fund, but you've got something there and it's free money, effectively. And if hopefully in a year's time, I can pay it back. And if it hopefully will convert to the bounce back loan, so therefore the favourable terms will be much better. The only other observation was my accountant tells me with the self-employed import support scheme, that is taxable. So if you do get that money, as I did, it is taxed. Just bear that in mind.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tony. Yeah, you will need to declare the 3-month loan if you get it when you do your next self-assessment return in January. And remember what I said, HMRC will not be coming after the self-employed for the payments on account in July, which they normally do, but they will be expecting to get that in January. So people are going to have to be prepared for a whole year's worth of tax going in one hit in January rather than the 6 months that you normally expect to do in January.
Right, thanks, Tony. And the final question, Gordon Patterson, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask us.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could comment on the fact that I personally have furloughed myself from my own PSC company as director of that. So can you then unfurlough yourself if you're offered a couple of days work, which would pay perhaps more than the amount I'm receiving just now via furlough, and then refurlough yourself because it was only 2 days work?
Right, furloughing has to be done on a minimum 3-week basis. So if you've done 3 weeks of furlough, I've not been asked this question before, but my understanding of the legislation is, yes, you could unfurlough yourself, do a bit of work, and then furlough yourself again, but you would have to furlough yourself for a minimum of 3 weeks and that second block. Okay?
Right.
Tony, sorry. Go on,
Gordon. Just the added on question is that, like most people in the PSC company, at the end of my financial year, I would receive the dividend, which would make up most of my income for the year. But at the present moment, there's no money going into the company to pay that dividend. So will any of the schemes that are running just now perhaps be available later in the year when people put in their year-end accounts and discover there is no dividend that can be paid?
To be honest, Gordon, we don't know. I mean, as I've explained, we are lobbying to get the self-employed scheme extended to the same date as the employees' furlough scheme, which is the end of October. And we haven't made much progress on that. As for business support later in the year, it all depends on what the government's willing to do. They're clearly feeling the pain of the tens of billions of pounds that have so far been paid out. How long they can keep that going remains to be seen, and all sorts of ominous noises about how the next generation paying the interest on the loans of their grandparents and parents. But let's wait and see. Okay, wait and see.
All right, brilliant. I just had a quick rider on that, Tony. Most people will be aware that there is a talk about the furlough scheme being new applications being stopped at some point, and the issue that Gordon just spoke about, which is taking yourself off furlough to do a job and going back on. Do we think that would be likely to count as a new application?
I don't know, because we haven't seen the details of what changes might be made to the furlough scheme. But I'd be wary of that. And if you've got an accountant, check with them or check with us. Okay.
Okay. Right. Look. Thanks.
Hello, John. I haven't seen you for a long time. John Lord. Right.
Hello, John. Look. Thanks everybody for all that. Any more questions you have? I see a lot more has come in on the text. I will at some point go through the text and try and pull out all the questions that aren't answered and put them in. If you email obnetwork@bectu.org.uk, we'll also deal with them, and we'll try and put all of that in the post-match email that you'll get sometime next week. Okay, look, we're going to move on really to the meat of the meeting now, which is, first course took quite a long time. We're going to move on to this, the entree, which is really about our fears and thoughts on how we go to work post or during the COVID-19 pandemic, as lockdown begins to be released and people begin to think about opening up. I mean, I know horse racing, for example, is starting next week on a very limited basis behind closed doors. I know that there's talk of football starting. So what there is there's a huge amount of kind of not very specific to OBs information out there, and I will put references to a whole lot of that in the email that goes out after this meeting. There is obviously the government guidance on working outdoors. It's not very helpful in an OB context, and the government guidance which will apply in some of our venues on working in homes, for instance, and offices. There is Bectu's, well, I'll come to Bectu's later. There's the British Film Commission guidance due out any time now about the TV industry. And of course, the broadcasters themselves have got together and put out some guidance. I guess on top of all that, when people go back to work on OBs, if you're in a big venue, certainly a race course, Premier Football Ground, Albert Hall, any big studio complex, you're going to almost certainly have another overlay of their rules to follow as well. But at the moment, none of the rules we've seen are very OB specific. The nearest you'll get really is what people in Bectu have done, and you can find all that referenced on the Camera Branch website. So if anybody needs to see the Camera Branch website, go to the Camera Branch, Google the Camera Branch, it comes up absolutely first. But really, Bectu is setting up a working group starting on Monday, which is looking at how we do guidance specific to our industry. It's actually entertainment, factuals, and outside broadcasts, because there's such a huge overlap. So there's a working group starting. It's a work in progress. Quite a lot of you have read the document that's currently on the Bectu website, produced by the assistant directors. That very, very specific really to the film industry, but it's got some useful thoughts there, for example, on how you deal with, carrying a lens that takes two people to carry it. So really, having given that very brief introduction, having said to you that what we're doing is Bectu is planning to have a working group. One of the outputs I'm looking for this meeting is for some Bectu members who are keen to take part in that working group to put themselves forward. It will obviously meet in the way we're meeting now. It'll use remote technology, Zoom. First meeting is on Monday, so we'll be looking for people there. But really, the rest of the meeting is over to you. I'm going to float as people raise their hands and say their points. I'm going to float a number of polls through about how people feel about working now and in the future. So please help with the polls. They'll help inform us what areas matter most in the discussion. But really, this is for people to say, how they think they might work safely, or what their worries are. We probably won't be able to deal with all of them here, obviously, but obviously this is being recorded. We will be taking notes, and it will feed into the work Bectu is doing on producing industry-specific guidance. I hope that's okay as an introduction. I'm really just looking for hands up or people with anything to say. Jamie Benning.
Hi, I work as a EVS operator predominantly in sport. Obviously, our position on the truck or in the TV compound is shoulder to shoulder with the next operator. One of the concerns that I've got is that I've got potentially some work coming up in July and August. Do you know if there's been much talk amongst the big sporting companies about what they're going to do with regards to that? And are they looking at people like the Bundesliga in Germany who've managed to kind of come up with a kind of interim solution, as well as NASCAR in the States, who posted a video showing one EVS op here, one EVS op, 10 feet in that direction, filling a large hangar? It's going to obviously have a huge impact on how we do OBs. Has there been much discussion about the proximity issue?
Not in this country that I'm aware of. I mean, what we're hoping is another thing, an output I would like from this meeting is actually for us to make contact with OB companies. I've got a mailing list of addresses, and just invite them to talk to us to collaborate on this, because I haven't heard much. But, you talk about EVS operators, pretty much anything that happens in an OB truck inside a scanner can't happen the way we're used to it. So I'm guessing there'll be an awful lot of D-rigs, and there'll be an awful lot of remote production. I don't know what people think. Look, thanks for that contribution. Basically, we'll hear what everybody says. We won't try and deal with it on a point-by-point basis, because otherwise people won't all get to say their point. But notes are being made. Charles Battison.
Thank you very much. It was just following up from Jamie's question as well. Me and him are both EVS operators, even though I work on the Dreamcatcher. But I've got my first gig in Yarmouth in a couple of weeks' time. And I've also shared the same concerns about sitting in an outside broadcast truck, especially one of Racetech's, which they are predominantly small compared to, say, the ITV trucks. It's just the sort of concern of social distancing, as well as handling kit that I'm using for the stewards. I just wanted to sort of bring my opinion to the table about, how are we going to effectively do social distancing to make sure that we don't spread anything.
I think that is, the two big issues that were addressed by the document that's already been done for film. And the two big issues are transmission, avoiding transmission through social distancing, and avoiding transmission through vectors that could carry the virus. And in our environment, you'll be, if you're sitting a 19-inch rack distance away from your colleague, you are sharing the same air. And if you sit down when you have a shift change, not that many of such things exist anymore, obviously, you'll be handling the same faders or joysticks or mixer buttons that somebody else was handling 5 minutes ago. So the answer is, I don't know the answers to all of that. I do know, actually, specifically Racetech issued their guidance yesterday. Have you had that?
No, I've not actually received that.
Okay, so sorry, no. Racetech are, I think, planning to issue their guidance today. I got it.
Oh.
I haven't had a chance to view it, because as one of my other sins is I look after the Racetech branch. So they sent that to us as information. But Racetech have their own guidance, which is an overlay on the British Horse Racing Association guidance. So I haven't had a chance to read it, so I can't feed back what their views are on it. But this is a live situation, so ask them what you're going to be working to. I'm pretty sure they're going to tell you. They're operating a test. The British Horse Racing Association, I believe, has a safety test. Everybody who's going to work on a race course in any capacity is required to do the test. How good it is, I don't know, but I assume you'll be asked to do that. Louise.
Sorry, the hazards of having two screens and clicking in the wrong place. Right, we are all obliged to be consulted by our employers about safety. That is in the law. You have to be consulted. And the way most OB companies do that is when they issue their planning sheets, at the back of that, you have a risk assessment. So in my view, you should be getting a risk assessment from your employer about the job you're going to be doing. And if you don't think it's safe enough, then you are able to say, no, I'm not going to do it. Now, obviously, the financial pressure upon you is that you want to do it because you want to earn some money, I would ask you to consider, is it worth it if you think your life's in danger? My second point would be that as part of this working party that happens on Monday, and I think I'm going to volunteer for that, we need to set up a generic, I think, our own risk assessment and say, we recommend this, and unless this is in place, we will probably recommend to our members that they don't take the job.
Louise, I mean, I think that's spot on. I think that's exactly what we're looking at. What I'm thinking is what we need is a set of what we would expect, the expectations that people can measure what they're being asked against. And that will produce points where people might challenge what they're being told. Because obviously everybody feels really unsafe. And whilst potentially somebody sneezing on you is a death sentence, we don't know. I was in the supermarket the weekend, somebody pushed past me in the aisle. I think I call it the Cummings effect. It seems to have changed in the last week. It's become okay. And it's become okay to push past you and say sorry and raise your eyes. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, very sorry, very appropriate. You might just have condemned me to death, or are you? So it's, and I feel, we've got new government guidance yesterday. We're now allowed, there's a little bit of loosening on how we can meet. There are still 300 odd people dying every day who didn't die of the same cause last year. That's a lot of people still. And that's the new norm. The government is quite happy with that. That's what we're going to be moving out of. We're now at a point where R is lower than 1. So the hospitals are coping. And the strategy is to just keep the number of people dying at the level the hospitals can cope with. So people are going to keep dying of this for quite a long time. Our job is to make sure we don't die if we can avoid it, and that our colleagues and the members of the public that we come into contact with don't die. So Louise, brilliant. Thanks for that. But yeah, great contribution. Sean O'Malley.
Hello. So I think I saw in answer to Close Workings, one of the OB companies was fitting screens into their trucks between people. Which was on social. I'm not sure that's absolute, but I remember seeing something like that on social media a couple of weeks ago. The other concern for us all is working tenders. I think some of this is covered in the film document, the AD document, but more specifically in OBs, we all tend to work out of the same truck. Every department has to go in, get their gear out, and the time pressure to get that in, rigged, and taken into the stadiums, which also have their own security. So quite often the compound is outside of the venue, and getting the equipment in gives an added pressure, carrying it hundreds of meters to get there. So how, there has to be an element of supervision and cooperation about how that's performed and how departments work together in a closed space such as a tender, and also when they're rigging, say, in a commentary box.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Sean. You're spot on. I mean, we all know the scenario. I can see some OBs. You do a long OB, a long entertainment or show, you might be sitting in an OB truck for 12, 14 hours on and off for most of that time next to other people. So are they going to put screens between the operators and then cut a door behind each position? I don't think so. So, the tension might be, we would expect people maybe to operate out of porter cabins. You might have a vision porter cabin with everything spaced miles away and different entrances. You might have a sound porter cabin. You might have the mixer back somewhere else completely. How are we actually going to do it? Because if we are living with this thing, none of us want our job to be a death sentence. Important. Okay, thanks for that. Andy Campbell next.
Hello, everyone. Sean, you can tell me if this is an okay thing to suggest, but I was going to say, as we all go back to work over the next weeks and months, I think it would be a good idea if we shared with the union all of our, every time we get sent a risk assessment or a document that outlines an OB company's policies on avoiding COVID, if we could send that to the union, we could then sort of build up a list of the different approaches that all the different companies are taking, and we could say, we could then start thinking about things like, okay, well, this company's doing this really well, but they're not doing this quite so well. then we could almost mix and match what they're saying. We could encourage what we see as good practice, and then try and discourage what we see as bad practice. But I don't know if it's okay to share those documents, publicly, well, not publicly, but with the union. Maybe you can let me know.
Thanks, Andy. Well, look, I mean, that's a really good idea. Camera Branch already is running whistleblowing form is the wrong thing, but he's running something on the Camera Branch website for camera operators to use, or sorry, members of the camera department to use for that sort of purpose in terms of what's happening. So I'll look and talk to other people about what we can do, because actually that's quite useful. In terms of what a previous contributor said, the companies, all employers should be consulting with all their workers and with their trade unions. And, so I'm going to go proactively to the companies and saying, all your freelance workers, consulting doesn't consist, it was Louise raised it, consulting doesn't consist of sending a risk assessment. Consulting needs to be something slightly more active, in my view. So, this is work in progress. Andy, if you had the time and you could join the working group, that'd be brilliant, because really, at the end of this meeting, what I'm going to do is call for volunteers. We'll move things on. Thanks for that. John Willis next, sorry. John Willis?
Hi there, that's me. No one.
Hi.
Yeah, I was having in the past worked with the professional divers and do a lot of work with the American companies. The American entertainment producers are talking about working on a month contract where they'll take a 2-week quarantine, test everybody as they come out of it, work for a month, and then expect everybody to take a 2-week break. That seems to me to be a not ridiculous idea. Professional divers, after all, take 6 weeks in a pressure chamber with each other. They don't infect each other. They are tested. Now, I think it's expensive, but I'm looking at what we were saying earlier about people in supermarkets and people we want to work with and interact with closely inside our tenders and trucks. Are we dumb not to be pushing for that kind of idea too?
Thank you, John. I mean, the issue comes, none of us have ever found it easy to get more money out of any OB engager ever. They're quite tight, and actually most of them don't run at a huge profit. So should we, should industry, should Bectu be actually lobbying government? Pretty much every company in our industry and lots of other industries is going to be running at a loss this year, because the cost of producing something like any OB is going to be escalated very highly. You're going to probably have fewer people. They're going to be spread apart. There's going to be all sorts of extra measures impeding efficient working, and the costs are going to go. Now, the OB company, if it pays that alone, will go bust. So it has to charge more to the customer, and so on. That rattles up the chain. So everybody's going to be working at a loss. Is that loss, should that loss incorporate the fact, if you turn up at work with a bit of a cough maybe, or you had a bit of a headache that morning, but you turn up at work and you spread COVID-19, coronavirus anyway, around your colleagues, and you did it because there's no support and you're bust, you need the money, it obviously makes sense from a point of view of society and the workers that there's a better protection net there for those who feel they have to drop out because they're ill, because otherwise they may turn up. And 9 times out of 10, it may be not a problem, but that 1 time out of 10 might kill somebody. And you might know you killed somebody, and that's not a nice place to be. So, part of what we need to be looking at is what people are asking for in terms of the support society is going to give workers going forward until we can find out what normal is. One assumes that whatever normal is in the long run, talking 2 or 3 years away, will be something where costs will balance out. But in the short term, the focus is on keeping everything going so that everybody's not on the dole, unemployed. And that is going to need companies to keep going, even though they're losing money, in my opinion. I don't know if Tony's got an opinion on that. No, Tony knows no more than I do. It's all guessing. I mean, thanks, John. That's great. James French, next.
Hi. I can't help thinking that with social distancing, normal OB working is never going to be completely safe. And I just wonder whether we're going down the wrong alleyway, trying to work out ways of doing that. Surely it would be better that when we booked to go to an OB, we arrive on site, we're tested for COVID-19. We don't do anything, go near anybody until the results of those tests are known. If you're tested and clear, you can then all work together perfectly safely. And then at the end of the job, you go home and you work, you go home, and the next time you go on a job, you're tested again.
That may well be part of the solution. That may well be the only way of doing it. But, you know, there will be people who, unless you come up with a test which spots people when they're pre-symptomatic, that indicates they're carrying coronavirus, there's probably always going to be a period of 2 or 3 days where somebody can pick it up and spread it to somebody else. So it's all a matter of probabilities and percentages of improvement. And who picks the cost up if you're turned away from work because you can't do it because you failed the test? So that's back to John's point before. You know, we need to have an understanding of how that works, because otherwise you might think you're going to do all right next year. You might have a few nice bookings. You might have 3 weeks at Wimbledon or 2 weeks at some tennis back to back. And then a cough, a test, no income for the month, you know, at the right time of year. So it's a really valid question. And I don't have an easy answer. I don't think anybody does at the moment, but these are the questions we need to be dealing with and asking. So over to Keith next. Keith Davis.
Hi, Sean. Okay. I just got a query on here. On RaceTech social distancing, like they put a thing about the current government recommendations for social distancing are 2 meters, but they've then got the clause for 15 minutes or longer. So RaceTech are determined that it's okay to be closer than 2 meters for less than 15 minutes. Have you heard such a thing? Is that true or what? But I mean, because on a vision engineer in the scanner on racing, you'll be doing 10 minutes work, 20 minutes break. So is this something someone's made up, or is this actually a government thing? I mean, they're quoted it as the current government recommendations.
I haven't heard that. I mean, you know, Tony's shaking his head as well, so I won't ask him to speak. As far as I'm aware, what the legislation or what the rules in place and the guidance in place says is that you must maintain social isolation doing your job when possible, and you must minimize close contact when it isn't possible. So it's not 100% absolute that you have to maintain social distancing, but actually I think, you know, I would be asking questions there about how do we ensure that when you are in that environment that you're not distanced, you're safe. And we're actually potentially talking about PPE there, because that will, again, it doesn't make you safe, but it makes you safer. If you're the only person racking in that position, you're going in and out, you're probably not worried about touching the controls, but you are breathing next to somebody else who might infect you. So maybe, you know, some form of, we know masks are not 100% effective, and we know masks aren't to stop you catching the disease. If it's the regular surgical mask, is to stop you spreading it, but maybe everybody should be required to wear one of those. I don't know, you know, but that's a very relevant point, Keith, and I've made a note, and we'll try and get some advice on that. And next is Phil's iPad. Phil.
Hi there. First of all, thanks for holding this meeting. I work in the camera department, so I don't really spend a great deal of time in the trucks, you know, in the gallery and the EVS ops. But I don't know if people have seen, there's a post recently by BT Sport about how they're managing to work remotely with some of the EVS from home, the PA and the directors. I don't know if that's the way forward.
I think it's certainly a way forward that will be used where it's possible for some people. I'm pretty sure of that, yeah. Okay, so on to Tony Wass again.
Hi, yeah, it was just a couple of things. I mean, the problem with OBs, it's in the word outside broadcast. We're out on location, we're with people. I think it's a very difficult region we work in, because unlike film and TV, where it's fairly controlled, we know what we're doing, we have a more uncontrolled situation which involves members of the public, be it concerts, be it sports events. I mean, these are obvious things, but you know, I can't see at the moment how we're going to get this to work. And also, as somebody who runs an OB company, I am concerned about insurance. It's never mentioned about this, public liability insurance. I mean, what happens if, it was proved that my company or somebody gave somebody COVID? Is this being thought about?
Tony, do you want to pick up on the PLI?
Yeah, hello, Tony. Yeah, I've spoken to our insurers who actually do the public liability insurance stuff. It won't cover you for, most policies won't cover you for the spread of infectious diseases. And if you've got business insurance, which would be employers' liability insurance, as well as public liability and possibly business continuity insurance, you really need to read the exclusion clauses, because after the SARS epidemic of, when was it, about the year 2000, insurers began to put policies in, all right, the policy exclusions in, which specifically excluded claims that were the result of infectious diseases. Most policies will cover the closure of premises. So if you can't get into your premises because you've been banned from using them due to an infectious disease, there is a degree of cover there. And to get cover for things like coronavirus, ever since SARS, you've had to effectively pay a top-up premium, which is quite high, in order to cover against that specific risk, because it's not part of the general coverage anymore. And it's not widely reported, but the insurance industry at the moment it's partly in meltdown and partly in a big row with everybody. It's partly in meltdown because lots of people have discovered that their policies don't work. So if in many circumstances, people have got cancellation clauses and they're just asking for the money back. All right. So the insurance industry is doing lots of refunds at the moment. And of course, secondly, they have got people very upset about this problem of their insurance policies, which they thought might cover them for this eventuality, not actually covering them. So that's, in short, that's the answer to your question. I think everyone who's worried about this needs to check their policies. Our public liability insurance is fine for the moment. It won't necessarily cover you for infectious disease. On the other hand, it's unlikely that anyone's going to get an individual claim against them for to spreading an infectious disease. I think from the employer's point of view, you probably do need to think it through, because if you can demonstrate that there weren't adequate management processes in place to prevent the transmission of an infectious disease in a given work situation, you may have some sort of claim against the employer.
Okay.
Thanks, Tony. Paul Mellon, next. Unmute yourself, please.
Hello. Just a thought on, I'm in the camera department, so not one of the people that's generally in a truck working shoulder to shoulder with a vision engineer or an EVS operator, but I'm concerned that the air conditioning that's required to make that environment operable, is that being assessed as part of the risks that OB providers are calculating? In the summer, there was a UEFA under-19 women's football tournament that I worked on, and we operated remotely in a porta cabin. Not all of the cameras, because especially for the big lenses, you've got to actually physically be in the stadium to be able to see what's going on. But we were sat, as I say, shoulder to shoulder in an improvised working environment with temporary air conditioning that couldn't cope with the temperatures and the added heat from the equipment. So I just think it would be very worthwhile making that point, or consulting health experts. What are the dangers posed by working in an air-conditioned environment at close quarters?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I've got a note of that. I don't think we know anything about that, do we, Tony, at the moment?
Well, there's a lot of research going into air conditioning. I remember raising this at the very beginning of all this stuff when I said, how are cinemas going to cope? Because they have ferocious ventilation. And there's been investigation into two things, really, the transmissibility of the virus and also its ability to sustain its existence at certain temperatures. And apparently there's a sort of sweet spot where it's not too hot, not too cold, where the virus doesn't actually survive very well at the temperatures the aircon systems can churn out. I'll just remind everybody, the broadcasters, not the OB companies, but I think they'll be governed by this, did sign up to something that was published about 2 weeks ago. And you'll find it on the ITV website for some reason. But it's a 15-page COVID code of conduct, really, they're all committed to. It makes a passing reference to ventilation by saying that ventilation should be good, right? And it's a very studio-based document, all right? There is reference to people who have to work in close proximity and can't manage the 2 meters separation. And I'll just confirm, there's no mention of time as a parameter in social spacing here, and there isn't in the government guidance. I mean, but there is provision in this guidance for working at less than 2 meters. One of the control factors that they outline in the document is perspex screens, basically, between people who have to be closer than 2 meters apart. And I know for a fact, because I was talking to BBC Health and Safety about this last week, the BBC is already installing them in the news galleries at New Broadcasting House in London. And I know all about it because they were designed and built by one of our safety reps in the building. So I've got good inside information. However, there are other references to things like reducing the number of people in each space. There are things like considering timing, which I don't think is going to work for OBs, but timing of tasks so people don't have to be in the same space together at the same time. They're actually quite deprecatory about masks, to be honest. They're basically saying they should only be used in clinical settings or where you were already using masks as PPE. For example, if you were sawing bits of wood or spraying something or what have you. You know, if in your normal work you would wear a mask, yes, do, but don't think that wearing a mask is going to somehow help you out in the COVID situation, either preventing you spreading it or preventing you catching it.
Thanks, Tony. Look, I've got some more contributors. I'm just going to run through a few points from some of the chat that's coming in. One was about the idea of sharing planning sheets. It's been observed that planning sheets are often viewed as restricted and commercially sensitive. Obviously, what we can say is you can share anything with Bectu. If you're a union member, we are entitled to represent you and you're entitled to talk to us. And of course, that is also in complete confidence. That is to say, Fred Blogs gives me a planning sheet from ABC Productions Limited. I go to ABC Productions Limited if I have an issue. I will not say Fred Blogs has told me. You know, so commercial confidence, if you like, it's like a bit like the confessional, except you can admit your sins, but we can't absolve them. Somebody observes that, you know, there may be a possibility that we'll have antibody tests and a passport. I think we all hope that. What we don't know, of course, is that at the moment whether antibodies actually confer protection. The jury's out. The WHO changes mind every week. There's a lot of evidence that there are a number of coronaviruses in circulation that we have in the common cold where protection of our own immune system lasts for less than 3 months. SARS and MERS both are not ones where previous exposure guarantees you don't get it again. So we're hoping, but we don't know. I'm told there are firewall issues with using EVS remotely at the moment. I'm just passing that on. I've also got some links which I'll circulate about work going on in air conditioning and about actually the very valid point that maybe what we want to be doing is considering whether it's possible to ask people to retrofit HEPA filters, which remove 95% of pretty much all airborne stuff from air conditioners in the areas we'll be working in. Okay, so John Lord, your question next. John Lord.
Hi, Sean. Sorry, I was just sending you on a chat, so it's difficult to unmute. Are you hearing me now?
We're hearing you.
Sean, it's the 2 meter and 15 minute that the race tech gentleman brought up. I think what that confusion is that SAGE WHO said that you're unlikely to get any COVID if you were 2 meters apart and less than 15 minutes duration. The German government famously, it's 1 minute apart, 1 meter apart, but less distance, less time. So I suspect that's where Racetech have pulled that little piece of information from. I had one other one, and it's a very brief note for you moving forward. Obviously, in the outside broadcast world, a lot of the events, the production team aren't in control of the event. So for the camera crew, where you are in the event, they're in control of you. The CTV, NEP, OB companies are beheld to the production companies, and obviously the crews, whether they're in the truck or on the road. James, I'm sorry, I don't want to arrive at a venue 2 days before it to be tested and wait until I'm allowed in. It's too long a day. We have to find a way of making all that work through. I accept that's all very difficult, but the events are the problem. You only have to look at Captain Tom when he was on his birthday. There was a very good cutaway on the BBC News and I think on ITN News, which was all the snappers taking the one picture of him in the wheelchair showing his medal. They were all about 30 centimetres apart, the lot of them, about 6 of them. So it's not going to be easy. Anyway, I'll let you make notes and pass on. Good luck, everybody.
All right, thanks for a lot of that. I mean, as regards distance, what I read yesterday, the government was saying is that 1 metre as opposed to 2 metres for the same length of time increases the risk of your transmission, of transmitting the virus by between 10 and 30, not percent as a factor. So if you move down from 2 metres to 1 metre, you're somewhere between 10 and 30 times as likely to catch the virus if the other person has it. And obviously, therefore, I guess you would say 1 metre is somewhere between a 10th and a 30th of 15 minutes would give you the same exposure risk. So anywhere between a minute and a few seconds. All right, Andy Campbell.
Hello again. I'm going to have to leave the meeting in about 5 minutes, so sorry for that. I just wanted to say, should we maybe think about a culture change in the industry, sort of between ourselves? Maybe I've not been in the industry long enough to have the enthusiasm beaten out of me, but often I perceive like the ethos of OB is that the show must go on at any cost. Maybe we need to have a more risk-averse approach, take things slower, put reducing risk before production ideals, because it's when you're rushing to do something that, you know, sometimes the director dreams something up off the top of his head and says, "Can you make it work?" And you go, "Yeah, I can do that." And you work really hard for about 15 minutes, get another cable and get another camera in. It's just those are the moments when corners get cut and mistakes are made.
So, I mean, that's a really good point, Andy. You're absolutely right. You know, the culture that everybody works into OBs is you take more and more risk, both with everything, and particularly with yourself and your health, as the pressure mounts and you get closer to a deadline. We've all done it. You know, we've got backs. Lots of us of my age have got backs that went out because we just thought, I can't wait for somebody to help me move that box. We've all done it. We've all been there. You know, we've cut live cables in the rain and joined them with us, being careful and all sorts of stuff. We all know that. And yeah, so you're right. Partly it's a culture change in that we should say, occasionally be prepared to push back and say, actually, you know, when Sean in Bectu started work, you started a football match with 5 cameras, but you only used 4 of them. And if one went, you could use the 5th, your hot spare. And actually, if one went down, they managed with 3 cameras. And maybe we're actually heading back to a point where some failure has to become acceptable because the human consequence of not accepting it is not acceptable. And the other point of view, obviously, is as every single person, I mean, I know I don't have to even ask this question, every single person that ever works on OBs generally curses the planning. Even the person that does the planning curses the person that told them what to plan. You know, it is something where actually that has to be planned in. So the risk assessment and the planning needs to be clear. If something goes wrong, what do we do? It's a whole new level of planning required, you know. Okay.
I've got to go. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, Andy. I'll put you on the working group.
Cheers. Thank you. Cheers.
Pete Murray.
You actually just the point I was going to bring up. You just actually addressed in your answer just now.
Okay. Look,
we should really be looking to minimise the amount of us that are going to be on site. So if there are venues that we can cover from 1 or 2 cameras, surely that's got to be the way forward. Tony alluded to earlier about the insurances and the liabilities of companies. But I think what we really should be doing as a union and as a group is pressuring both companies and government to make it comfortable for us to say that we're not well enough to go to work. So if I'm starting to feel symptoms, I don't want to I want to be comfortable to say I can stay at home and I'm still going to be financially stable enough through government support or whatever to say I'm not putting the rest of that crew at risk. Because there's a whole world of litigation there, isn't there? If I'm knowingly going to a site, being with symptoms, I risk infecting the rest of the crew, or somebody else feels that because I need the work, I need the money, I've not been supported for so long, I am desperate for income. So I think that's the big challenge that we all have to face is we need support from government to make it easy to say I'm not well enough to go to work and the risk is too high.
Have you disappeared on us, Pete? Has everybody disappeared? Have I disappeared?
Apologies,
Okay, look, I mean, that's a really good point, you know, and so that comfort factor includes how many of us have taken a show that we didn't really want to do, that maybe we didn't really have time to get to because we didn't want to say no because we thought that particular company wouldn't book us again. And there's a huge comfort factor that we need in the fact that if you actually say loads of thumbs up, we've all done it. It's happened to every single person. I know it's happened. We need that comfort factor that if you're on a big show or a little show and you say, I don't feel well, I'm worried about the risk I'm going to pose, that the company actually doesn't blame you for that, there's no black mark saying don't rebook that person. And that's going to require actually a shift within us as well as within the engagers. Look, I have, sorry, I've got an iPad got its hand up. I was going to say we're running out of hands up. I've got an iPad's hand up. iPad, unmute yourself, please.
Sorry, I'm Prue. I'm also a camera operator. Just following on from what John Willis and Andy Campbell were saying, I just wondered whether, we need a cultural change because job security is pretty pants in our, from these short-term engagements as freelancers. Also, a way of reducing contact. Wouldn't it be better to keep people working with their skill? We've all got the same skill set. Why don't I cover my area and work with teams, in my area, covering the live events in my area? That would reduce the amount of people I'm in contact with. It might help a culture of job security, of knowing, well, at least for the next month or two, these are the events. I can plan for that better. I'll be working with people more regularly, which will be a nice culture to have a more regular team. I just think this could actually ultimately create a nicer working environment for all of us with a bit more job security, and yes, putting safety first, and it reduces the amount of contact. Why would I go off based in Bristol to film events in Yarmouth or when there's plenty probably of live events happening within an hour of where I actually live? Now, I just wanted to put that to something we could suggest for a safe working practice, reduce the movement of us, and actually, in a way, it stops us all competing for a little pocket of work based in London, and we're all like, well, I've got stuff in my area, Wanted to put that to everybody, see if I've not thought of something.
Oh, I mean, that's if we could work out how to do it, I think it's a really good idea. Maybe somebody will.
Sean, can I chip in?
Yeah, do, Tony.
Yeah, look, the concept of having regular cohorts where to do specific tasks, you have the same team of people, right, is actually built into the broadcasters' guidelines on COVID that were agreed a couple of weeks ago between all the big broadcasters. Now, having spoken to the BBC about this, they can manage round this. So it's quite easy for them where they've got regular shows to make sure the same people are in the same space to do the same show. And if so, and you confine infection to a small cohort of people rather than get it right through the building. But having worked on OBs, I think that the current labour market in OBs probably makes that quite difficult to do. But I think it's an idea the working party should pick up. And our sister on the iPad is absolutely right. I mean, that is one of the recommended controls that in other circumstances, broadcast employers and others are trying to put in place. But it will be difficult on OBs because 95% of people are freelance. Whereas the BBC, for example, whom I was talking to about this last week, it has regular teams of people coming in, on a regular basis, working, 40 hours a week, 60 hours a week, whatever it is. And it's probably easier to manage around it than it is for ad hoc teams that get put together program by program. The other thing I was going to say, following my discussion with the BBC, was that part of the discussion was their intention to introduce mandatory temperature testing at the entrances to all their buildings, where there were sort of mixed feelings about this. But I did make the point at the time, look, it's very easy if you're a staff member, you turn up at Broadcasting House and you get turned away because you're too hot, right? We had a big discussion about whether you could go home on public transport, by the way. But if you're a freelancer, as I think John Lord pointed out, if you're a freelancer, you turn up, get your temperature tested, that's your job gone. So that's another issue I think that demarks freelancers from staff and needs to be thought through.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Look, I've run out of hands up. I get a sense that we've been round most of the issues people want to talk about at the moment. Just looking at screens of people, seeing people nodding their heads or shaking their heads would be quite handy. So I get that sense that we're. I'll take a handful more. It's now 12:35. I'll aim to end in probably maximum 10 minutes from now. Okay. As I've said before, for those who've come into the meeting relatively late, the chat, I'm receiving the chat. I don't get time to deal with all of it, but it will all be dealt with and dissected. Emails to me will be helpful. At the end of this meeting, we'll be talking about next steps. So, Jamie Benning, you're on now.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I think, moving forward and how we can kind of protect ourselves a bit more. I mean, amongst a few of the EVS ops on a WhatsApp group in the UK, we've had a few discussions about getting better contractual agreements in place because, this situation has really highlighted just how vulnerable we are. The advantages of being freelance have been completely outweighed by the disadvantages in this situation. So maybe it's time we thought about moving forward and getting contracts in place that give us some assurances and give us some security and some safety. I work on single day OBs. I also work on big motorsport OBs, tennis, all that kind of stuff. But so much of it is done on a kind of, nod and a wink. Oh yeah, you're available. Great. Okay. And, you might not even sign a document. You might sign a document for a pass perhaps, but you won't really sign a document that ensures, that you would be given maybe assurances about if a job was cancelled with maybe 2 or 3 weeks to go, are you going to get a partial payment? All of those sorts of things have become really, really been brought to the fore. And I think maybe it's time to think those through a bit more. None of us want to be a pain in the butt to our clients. This is the thing. And we're always aware that how fragile these relationships can be. But I do think it's time that we took a bit of a stand and, after all, they need our skills to do their job, to do the job as a team. So what does everybody think about that?
So Jamie, it's a very apposite kind of point for me to bring in the results of the last poll. I haven't shared the poll results in general because really I will share them in the post-match email if you like. But I think this is the question I asked really is what do people want us to focus on? I said leaving aside COVID-19 and then I put COVID-19 in there by implication as item 2, which is the one most people are concerned about. But leaving aside item 2, the first issue we've got that people would like us to address is to try and bring OB companies together. And the second one is actually to campaign for a new way of dealing with freelancers, a new contract, a new system, transparent taxation, benefits. I think pretty much everybody in the freelance world is recognizing that we're in a nonsensical situation. Most people will know what NEP did about personal service companies and sole traders earlier this year. Well, had they done that a year ago, they could have completely ruled people who were going to get some protection completely out of protection. And those things shouldn't be down to happenstance and accident. I was a sole trader. I was lucky. I managed to get my letter of authority through some fluke. Many of my colleagues, when my company wound up and they ended up in the freelance market, failed and ended up as personal service companies, running companies as directors with all those overheads through no choice of their own. And it's not where we end up is often the result of accident. It's not fair. We need something fair. We need transparent, and we need that you, as the workers, know what your rights and your duties are in a transparent way. That's my view. So that's on our agenda. Bringing OB companies together is on our agenda. And the third one actually is try and organise within OB companies. And what I'll say is, if you work for an OB company, where you're not organised, where Bectu has one or more members, including you, and you want to be organised, get in touch with me. You've got my email address, because I can't come out and see you at the moment, but when real OBs are happening and people are allowed to visit people other than their next of kin, I'll come and see you, and we'll get something going, you know, or we'll even get something going before I can see you. But it's always, I love coming. I love any excuse to get out of an OB, to see the faces. I've really enjoyed this meeting. It's been really nice meeting a lot of old friends and making some new ones. A couple of questions now. The plan would be to have another meeting of this type in a month or two to recap where we're at. Is that a good idea? Lots of thumbs up. It is a good idea. We will. I'll keep you informed. I'll keep this mailing list informed. Unless anybody's got anything burning to say, I'm going to draw the meeting to a close in a moment. Just looking for any last hands up. No. Okay, well, look, thanks ever so much for coming. Thanks, Tony, for your invaluable advice. Would those people who are willing to help with running the OB network, or with the Safe Working Group in OBs, or the Safe Working in OBs working group, please stay behind. So the meeting's over now. Thank you all very much for your participation. We'll have another one in a short length of time. You will get an email. It will take me time to unpick all the questions that I need to get answered and come to you, but you will get an email and you'll get an invite to the next one. Okay, thank you very much indeed. I've really enjoyed the meeting. I hope you found it useful.